All right. So I've been taking audio notes when I walk Bowie, and I'm accumulating quite a library of dog walking epiphanies, I call them. And they're not all gold, but sometimes I feel like whether a thought makes its way into my writing as an essay or not, it's nice to have a record of different dots I'm connecting at different times, with the hope that maybe there will be a new thought form or paradigm at some point worth sharing. So I did that today. I felt like, man, it was not that God was speaking through me, but it felt pretty profound. And then I recorded it, and of course, I listened back later, and the air conditioner behind me just made it almost incomprehensible. So I'm trying it again, hoping I can recapture the magic. No guarantees. But let's see, it sort of started with a train of thought, yes, while walking Bowie. But since then I've had other thoughts that might help make the point. So I'm going to start by saying anyone who's read The Great Gatsby might remember that Jordan Baker, I think Nick Carraway might be the one that says, well, she's a terrible driver. And I think it's Jordan Baker herself who says, well, that's only a problem until you meet another bad driver. And I just kind of love that metaphor in life, and that's kind of what I'm going to talk about here is the idea of that it's dangerous to be unevolved and it's dangerous to be unwoke. So I'm using terms, I think in my youth and my 20s before the whole term woke was even a thing, I had this opinion and call it the hubris of youth or the arrogance of youth, but I saw a lot of people as just kind of being sleepwalkers, just bumping around on autopilot and, occasionally colliding and then redirecting and wreaking a lot of havoc. And it might have been my peers, because I think that's what you do in your 20s. You sort of play at life and you play house, and you might have a lot of collateral damage doing that. But I think it was also just an indictment of everyone, older people. I saw these sleepwalkers as living unexamined lives. I mean, we've all heard the sentiment that an unexamined life is not worth living. Well, I did see a lot of people sort of, again, not being very lucid about the spiritual journey, that's the way I would have put it, and not taking spiritual opportunities that were literally laid in their path, and sometimes not doing their homework, meaning the transformation, the redemption, the atonement, the reconciliation, until literally on their deathbed. And there's a million reasons for that. Pride and ego obviously can stand in the way of taking those opportunities. Anyway, and then I went through about 2 decades of retiring that judgment and saying, you know what, we're all learning the same spiritual lessons in life, or the same life lessons, however you want to look at it. They just look different on different people. And who am I from the outside to say that anyone is sleepwalking or not lucid about their own emotional journey, their own spiritual evolution? In my old age, I'm kind of back to the former. During those same 20 years, I also happen to have given up on the idea of closure as a fantasy. I just accepted that life was messy and I didn't ever expect closure. So it's all connected in that, again, my worldview at this point is that it's actually irresponsible to blind oneself to the spiritual journey, to choose empiricism is the way I would put it, over rationalism, to choose materialism over the what's called the noosphere, like the invisible realm of our norms, mores, ideas, principles, laws, codes. And a lot of people really, really do make the choice to live their life in a superficial way. And again, these are words that I actually never used. I thought the word shallow was silly, but materialism is very real. So materialism and empiricism are very fashionable right now. And I've kind of come to this place where I really think it's not only irresponsible, it's actually dangerous to ignore the subtext in life. I guess I'll launch into a little story. Marianne Williamson, whom I love, often cites this story in the Bible in which Christ sort of disappears. They lose him in a marketplace, and Mary does not find him for 2 days. And he basically says, well, I'm about my Father's work now, which means, like, the rite of passage that is the bat mitzvah or the bar mitzvah, one is sort of weaned off parental guidance and becomes all about my Father's work, God's work, meaning suddenly, and I think there are fewer and fewer rites of passage in modern society that mark that moment when suddenly you are obligated to be your best self. You're obligated to contribute, right, to the collective march toward human potential, toward our capacity. I guess the word serious comes up for me. Like, not everything is serious in life, but online you'll see things like, ha ha ha, that's very funny, but we don't quite have world peace yet, so what's with all the levity? Personally, I love a good laugh. There's nothing better. Being about my Father's work, having substance, being lucid about the spiritual journey has nothing to do with being serious. Michael Beckwith often says, you know what, there's nothing serious going on here in the universe. If you listen to the Dalai Lama or Thich Nhat Hanh or any sort of wisdom keeper, all they do is laugh, and there's joy in their eyes. But you know what? It's not masking existential terror. So I don't think we need to be serious, but I do think we could stop masking our existential terror with the material and the superficial, all the while knowing not only are there societal ills and climate change and things like that we could, that warrant our attention, but actually in our own personal lives, just kind of wheeling around like tops and causing that collateral damage I mentioned a moment ago. It's not about tackling all the world's problems, but if we as individuals on the micro level did our homework, by extension, the world would be a better place. It sounds a little Pollyanna, but I mean, who can argue with the sentiment, be the change you want to see in the world? Gandhi. I guess you can't really argue with Michael Jackson either. Start with the man in the mirror. I guess another way of saying it is there's little value to the collective to just being a hedonist, right? So if we bide our time, we divert our attention and pacify ourselves and throw out the spiritual baby with the institutionalized religion bathwater by refusing to look at the subtext of life and live an unexamined life, we actually become a liability to the collective. I do think it's time that we all went about our Father's work, if that makes sense, and took life a little more seriously, meaning instead of, there's a few levels to this. I think in our own lives, we often choose, from the get-go, straight out the gate, there are those individuals who, through social conditioning, but also through the choice that is free will, choose their defense mechanisms over their core essence. And I know that's not going to land immediately, but artists, let's say, for example, are accused all day, every day of being sensitive. Of course, there's a connotation of vulnerable or reactionary attached to that. In my experience, the sensitivity they're referring to is actually a form of courage. It's the complete opposite. So it really just means you have heightened senses. When I hear that artists are more sensitive than others, for example, I think, actually, no. We all have the capacity to be sensitive, but we decide not to be in life. We choose not to look beyond the end of our nose. We choose empiricism, like I said. We choose the material, and that's what materialism is, over the rational. When it comes to sensitivity, if we understand sensitivity as having heightened senses, the truth is, of course there's a range, but within reason, we all have the same apparatus. Now, the way our brains, via their very individual, subjective chemical balances, reify the information is another story. But within reason, the range of perception is pretty universal among humans. I believe the inner ear can detect vibrations less than a diameter of an atom. We can distinguish sounds less than 10 millionths of a second apart. And in touch experiments, a single layer of texture applied to a wafer that was literally one molecule thick could be perceived by 71% of the participants. So artists do not have a monopoly on sensitivity, but they may actually have a monopoly on choosing not to tune out the world, to tune out the moment. Think about that. Now, of course, social conditioning plays a huge part in what I'm calling a willful decision to be insensitive. But imagine, for example, boys are taught not to be emotional creatures, but rather be linear, rational, logical, and intellectual. So that's a great way of kind of writing off not just the emotional subtext of a moment, but the emotional subtext in life. Similarly, when it comes to socialization being a factor in this myopic approach to life, there's a very convenient rationale for writing off what I call the spiritual subtext in life. Basically, the disillusionment with institutionalized religion, which is very well warranted. After, a couple bloodbaths and a couple molestations, it makes sense that more than ever, it's fashionable to not only support the separation of church and state at all costs, but to completely throw out the spiritual baby, I call it, with the institutionalized religion bathwater. The disillusionment is well warranted. But my personal hope is that society will evolve to the point of embracing nuance and understanding that the word spiritual, it's just a word, and it just refers to anything that's not the body. It's that simple. It has little to do with institutionalized religion. So I hope some of that lands. It is a choice on some level, but it's also social conditioning. If one is taught to buck it up and pull oneself up by the bootstraps and, be a man, for example, then of course sensitivity is going to be the casualty. But I think it just unfortunately becomes a lifelong commitment to not, again, looking on beyond the end of one's nose. So the reason I think it's dangerous, and actually every single thing I write is about this, how within any given moment there's a subtext, right? There's the metaphysical level, the energetic level, which is actually arguably driving everything else. There's the psychological level, which of course people aren't in touch with their own passive aggression or their own neuroses or their own subconscious motivators. In a given moment, there might be fuel likely to combust if somebody comes into a moment with unexamined resentments or regrets. If another person comes in with preconceived notions because they've actually listened to gossip, for example. All of this can combust and blow up, and I've certainly been the victim of it, and it's largely what I write about. How when we don't look beyond the surface of life or a given moment, all that subtext will inevitably play out, and that's what manifestation is. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense. That's why I've developed the opinion that it's not only irresponsible, but dangerous to choose to be shallow. Another way I would put it is somebody always pays. It may not be you. If you choose to live an unexamined life, not take the spiritual opportunities laid in your path, to not be lucid about your own evolution and transformation, to not make a commitment to be reflective, to be introspective, to take all that life gives you and synthesize it and consciously co-create with the universe and create new thought forms and paradigms that you're going to mirror back into the world, you're being spiritually lazy for one, but you're also going to do a lot of damage to other people. And I feel very strongly about this. So I think it's time, frankly, that we're all about our Father's work. That we all find that rite of passage and choose to be our best selves. And that may not mean digging in the dirt. If you've already done your therapy and you know it makes you tick, I say look to the future, have a good spiritual practice, and don't dig in the dirt anymore, because it's the equivalent of beating a threadbare drum or perpetuating a narrative. But you know what? If you skip that step in your emotional maturity, get some therapy, because you are creating a lot of collateral damage for those around you if you live an unexamined life by choice. I hope some of that made sense, and yes, if it sounds like a call to action, it really is. On a very good day, I do think that everything exists for a reason and the pendulum swings for a reason. So if there are people that seem a little more woke, if they seem less unconscious and more conscious about their spiritual journey, more lucid about it, if they seem to not be on autopilot or seem not to be sleepwalkers or just bumper cars colliding into one another, if they actually seem more highly evolved, that means there are people here on the planet who are actually contributing to our regression if those are all progressive things, if mankind actually is evolving in terms of his consciousness, not just his biology, but his consciousness, and a word for that is the noosphere, if that's meant to evolve, and we're all meant to contribute to its evolution, and we are absolutely wired to contribute to propagation. The question I guess the materialists have is whether or not that evolution includes that invisible realm known as the noosphere. And I'm just going to say that consciousness itself, of course, is evolving all day, every day. I don't think anyone would ignore that there is a non-local intelligence in the universe. So I do think we're called upon to contribute to the proliferation of the species, but the propagation of consciousness on a larger level. So usually if you're not contributing to that, you're destroying, and I actually think there is value to those that are contributing to our regression and not our progression, because balance is a wonderful thing. Pendulum swings are a wonderful thing. They keep everything in balance. So on a good day, I do see the value of the unconscious people, the conscious people, the woke people, the sleepwalkers, all of it. But I've made a choice, or I guess it wasn't even a choice, it's just I'm kind of wired to contribute to the progress and not the regression, personally. And I guess this is a call to action because every movement does require, I don't know, a little bit of proselytizing, I guess. So it's a call to action. If you do feel like you haven't found your purpose yet, consider that we can all just play video games till the cows come home and divert ourselves and pacify and pass the time, but it's really driven by existential terror at that point. I think the fulfillment, the tranquility, the inner peace, the well-being, the satisfaction comes when we do plug in to a ministry, a calling, a purpose. And usually that's going to be something that benefits the collective. And I will leave it at that and get off my soapbox now. Bye-bye.